Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Zoe O'Connor, come to the front of the class this instant! The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the trembling second grader. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly rose from her seat, her legs feeling like lead as she shuffled towards the imposing nun. Sister Margaret's lips were pressed into a thin line, her brows furrowed in disapproval. You've been disrupting the class again, young man. This behavior is unacceptable. Zoe's eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking an escape, but there was none to be found. She could feel the weight of her classmates' stares, a mixture of curiosity and schadenfreude etched on their young faces. Sister Margaret reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a bright pink ribbon. Since you insist on acting like a silly little girl, perhaps we should treat you as one. The nun's gnarled fingers roughly gathered Zoe's short brown hair, twisting it into a small ponytail. With a flourish, she tied the ribbon around it, creating a ridiculous bow that stood out like a beacon. There, now you can sit back down and pay attention like a good little girl. The classroom erupted in laughter as Zoe stumbled back to her seat, her face burning with shame. But beneath the embarrassment, a small spark ignited, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but one that would smolder for years to come. As the day wore on, Zoe found herself constantly touching the ribbon, her fingers tracing its silky smoothness. The initial humiliation faded, replaced by a strange sense of comfort. When the final bell rang, she hesitated before removing it, carefully tucking it into her backpack instead of throwing it away. That night, as Zoe lay in bed, surrounded by the snores of her siblings in the cramped bedroom they shared, she couldn't stop thinking about the ribbon. She imagined herself wearing it again, this time by choice. The fantasy brought a smile to her face as she drifted off to sleep. Years passed, and Zoe's fascination with feminine attire only grew stronger. She found herself drawn to her sister's closets, sneaking peeks at their dresses and skirts when no one was looking. But it was her mother's wardrobe that truly captivated her imagination. As a nurse, Mrs. O'Connor's closet was filled with crisp white uniforms, starched to perfection. Zoe would often linger outside her parents' bedroom, watching as her mother got ready for work. The ritual was always the same: smoothing on white stockings, buttoning up the pristine dress, and finally placing the neat white cap atop her carefully styled hair. One afternoon, when the house was empty, Zoe couldn't resist the temptation any longer. She crept into her parents' room, heart racing as she opened her mother's closet. With trembling hands, she reached out and touched one of the uniforms, marveling at its softness. Before she could stop herself, Zoe was slipping on a pair of her mother's white stockings. The material felt cool and smooth against her skin, sending a shiver of excitement down her spine. She pulled on the dress next, inhaling the faint scent of starch and her mother's perfume. Standing in front of the full-length mirror, Zoe barely recognized herself. The uniform was too big, hanging awkwardly on her small frame, but she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt right. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Panic set in as Zoe scrambled to change back into her own clothes, hastily shoving the uniform back into the closet. As she raced back to her room, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, she knew that this was only the beginning. As Zoe grew older, her interest in crossdressing intensified. She became an expert at finding moments of privacy in the chaos of her large family, sneaking into her sister's rooms to try on their clothes when they were out. Each garment she donned felt like a small act of rebellion against the strict Catholic upbringing that surrounded her. But with this growing fascination came a deep-seated guilt and confusion. Zoe struggled to reconcile her desires with the teachings of her faith and the expectations of her family. She threw herself into sports and other traditionally masculine pursuits, hoping to quash the part of herself that yearned for silky fabrics and delicate lace. It was during this tumultuous time that Zoe began to notice a distance growing between herself and her mother. Mrs. O'Connor, always busy with work and tending to her daughters, seemed to have little time or patience for her son's emotional needs. Zoe watched with a mixture of envy and resentment as her mother fussed over her sister's hair and clothes while barely sparing her a glance. One particularly difficult day, after a grueling football practice where Zoe had once again failed to fit in with her teammates, she found herself alone in the house. The silence was oppressive, magnifying the loneliness that had become her constant companion. Without conscious thought, Zoe's feet carried her to her parents' room. She opened her mother's closet, the familiar scent of starch and perfume washing over her. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out a blouse and skirt, quickly changing into them. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the clothes to fit her lanky frame, Zoe felt a wave of emotion crash over her. Tears began to fall, streaking down her cheeks as she stared at her reflection. In that moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she could be the daughter her mother seemed to want, where she could openly embrace the part of herself she kept hidden. The sound of the front door opening jolted Zoe back to reality. She quickly wiped away her tears and changed back into her own clothes, but the memory of that moment stayed with her, a bittersweet reminder of the person she longed to be. As Zoe entered adulthood, the pressure to conform to societal expectations grew even stronger. She joined the military, hoping that the strict discipline and hypermasculine environment would finally cure her of her desires. For a time, it seemed to work. The rigorous training and demanding schedule left little room for introspection or secret indulgences. It was during this time that Zoe met Anna. She was everything Zoe thought she wanted: beautiful, kind, and utterly feminine. They fell in love quickly, and within a year, they were married. Zoe threw herself into the role of husband and provider, determined to be the man she believed Anna deserved. But as the years passed, the facade began to crack. Zoe found herself increasingly drawn to Anna's closet, sneaking moments to try on her clothes when she was out. The guilt ate away at her, but she couldn't stop. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the repressed feelings and desires came flooding back stronger than ever. Anna began to notice changes in her husband. Zoe grew distant, often lost in thought. She caught glimpses of a sadness in Zoe's eyes that she couldn't understand. When she tried to talk about it, Zoe would brush her off, insisting everything was fine. One evening, Anna came home early from a night out with friends to find Zoe standing in their bedroom wearing one of her dresses. The look of shock and horror on Anna's face would haunt Zoe for years to come. "What? What are you doing?" Anna's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Zoe stood frozen, unable to form words. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? The tears came unbidden, streaming down her face and smearing the makeup she had so carefully applied. I'm sorry," Zoe choked out. "I can explain." But there were no explanations that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. In the weeks that followed, they tried to talk, to understand, but the trust had been irreparably broken. Anna couldn't reconcile the person she thought she had married with the person standing before her now. The divorce was quiet and quick. Zoe didn't fight it, knowing that she had been living a lie. As she packed up her things, carefully hiding away the few feminine items she had accumulated over the years, she felt a mixture of grief and relief. The life she had built was crumbling around her, but for the first time in years, she could breathe. In the aftermath of her divorce, Zoe found herself adrift. She left the military, unable to continue living under the constant pressure to be someone she wasn't. With no real direction, she took a series of odd jobs, moving from city to city, never staying in one place long enough to form connections. But in the solitude of her small apartments, Zoe began to explore her true self. She started collecting women's clothing, building a wardrobe that reflected the person she felt inside. At first, it was just in the privacy of her home. A silky nightgown here, a pair of heels there. But gradually, she began to venture out, testing the waters of public presentation. It started small, a touch of mascara, a feminine cut to her jeans. Each step was terrifying, but exhilarating. Zoe began to notice the way people's perceptions of her shifted, the subtle changes in how she was treated. It was both thrilling and disconcerting. One evening, after a particularly rough day at her latest temp job, Zoe decided to take a bigger risk. She carefully applied her makeup, donned a modest dress, and stepped out into the world fully presenting as a woman. Her heart raced as she walked down the street, certain that at any moment someone would call her out, expose her for the fraud she felt she was. But nothing happened. People passed by without a second glance. A man held the door open for her at a coffee shop, offering a polite smile. For the first time in her life, Zoe felt truly seen, not as the person others expected her to be, but as her authentic self. As she sipped her latte, Zoe's mind wandered back to that day in second grade, to the pink ribbon that had started it all. She smiled to herself, realizing how far she had come from that scared, confused child. The journey had been long and painful, filled with self-doubt and societal pressure, but sitting there in that coffee shop, Zoe felt a sense of peace she had never known before. Of course, it wasn't always easy. Zoe still struggled with the fear of rejection, particularly from her family. She had distanced herself from them over the years, unable to bear the weight of their expectations. The thought of revealing her true self to them filled her with dread, but also with a longing for acceptance she couldn't shake. There were nights when the loneliness was overwhelming. Zoe would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever find someone who could love her for who she truly was. The memory of Anna's face on that fateful night would resurface, bringing with it a fresh wave of guilt and regret. But even in those dark moments, Zoe found comfort in the simple act of being herself. She would run her hands over the soft fabrics of her dresses, remembering the little boy who had marveled at his mother's nurse uniforms. She would carefully apply her makeup, each stroke of the brush an act of self-love and defiance against a world that had tried to force her into a mold that never fit. As the years passed, Zoe began to build a life that felt authentically hers. She found a job at a small bookstore, where her kind demeanor and extensive knowledge of literature made her a favorite among the regular customers. Her co-workers, a diverse and accepting group, became the first real friends she had had in years. It was at the bookstore that Zoe met Lily. She was a regular customer, always on the hunt for obscure poetry collections. At first, their interactions were limited to book recommendations and polite small talk, but over time, a friendship began to blossom. Lily was different from anyone Zoe had ever met. She had a quiet confidence about her, an acceptance of herself and others that Zoe found both intimidating and inspiring. As they grew closer, Zoe found herself wanting to open up, to share the truth about herself. One evening, after closing the store, Zoe invited Lily for coffee. Her hands shook as she stirred her drink, trying to find the courage to speak. "There's something I need to tell you," Zoe finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Zoe's. "You can tell me anything. I'm here to listen." And so, for the first time in her life, Zoe told her story. She spoke of the little boy who had been fascinated by ribbons and dresses, of the years of confusion and self-denial, of the failed marriage and the journey to self-acceptance. As she talked, the words came faster, years of pent-up emotion pouring out. When she finally fell silent, Zoe braced herself for rejection. But Lily's eyes were filled with nothing but compassion and understanding. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," Lily said softly. "You're incredibly brave, Zoe, and you're beautiful, inside and out." Tears welled up in Zoe's eyes, but for once they were tears of relief and joy. In that moment, she felt truly accepted for who she was, perhaps for the first time in her life. As Zoe left the cafe that night, she felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, the fear of public rejection, the potential backlash from her family if they ever found out. But for now, she allowed herself to revel in the simple joy of being seen and accepted. Walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, Zoe's mind drifted back to her childhood dreams. She remembered lying in bed, imagining a life where she could wear pretty dresses and ribbons in her hair without fear or shame. It had seemed like an impossible fantasy then, but now it was her reality. As she unlocked the door to her apartment, Zoe caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. She paused, really looking at her reflection. The person staring back at her wasn't the confused, frightened child she had once been, nor the man she had tried so hard to become. Instead, she saw a woman, strong, resilient, and finally at peace with herself. Zoe smiled at her reflection, a silent acknowledgement of how far she had come and the journey that still lay ahead. She may not have all the answers, and the road ahead might not always be easy, but for the first time in her life, she was excited to see where it would lead. As she got ready for bed that night, Zoe's hand brushed against something tucked away in the back of her drawer. She pulled it out, a small smile playing on her lips as she recognized the faded pink ribbon from all those years ago. Gently, she tied it in her hair, a reminder of where she had started and how much she had grown. Lying in bed, Zoe closed her eyes, allowing herself to dream of the future. But this time, the dreams weren't of escape or of being someone else. Instead, she dreamed of living openly and proudly as herself, surrounded by love and acceptance. And for once, that dream didn't seem so far out of reach. As Zoe grew more comfortable in her identity, she began to consider reaching out to her family. The thought filled her with equal parts hope and dread. She hadn't spoken to them in years, not since she'd left after her divorce. Would they even recognize her now? One crisp autumn morning, Zoe found herself standing outside her childhood home, heart pounding in her chest. The house looked smaller than she remembered, the paint slightly faded. She smoothed down her skirt, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then the door creaked open, revealing her mother's face. Mrs. O'Connor's eyes widened in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "Zoe?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Zoe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. For a moment, they stood frozen, years of unspoken words hanging between them. Then, to Zoe's surprise, her mother stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight embrace. "Oh, my child!" Mrs. O'Connor sobbed, her tears soaking into Zoe's blouse. "I've missed you so much." As they cried together on the front porch, Zoe felt a piece of herself click into place. It wasn't perfect. There would be long conversations ahead, explanations and apologies on both sides. But it was a start. Over the following months, Zoe slowly reconnected with her family. Some relationships were easier to mend than others. Her youngest sister, barely more than a child when Zoe had left, embraced her wholeheartedly. Others, like her father, struggled to understand, but made efforts to learn. Through it all, Lily stood by her side, a constant source of support and love. Their relationship deepened, growing into something Zoe had once thought impossible for someone like her. As winter gave way to spring, Zoe found herself back in her old neighborhood, this time with Lily by her side. They were headed to a family dinner, a regular occurrence now, though still sometimes fraught with tension. As they walked hand in hand, they passed by St. Mary's Catholic School. Zoe paused, looking at the building that held so many conflicting memories. "You okay?" Lily asked, squeezing her hand. Zoe nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Just thinking about how far I've come." She reached into her purse and pulled out a familiar pink ribbon. With practiced ease, she tied it into her hair, the bow sitting proudly atop her head. "Let's go," she said, turning away from the school. "My family's waiting." As they continued down the street, Zoe felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey hadn't been easy, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in her life, she was truly, unequivocally herself. The little boy who had once been humiliated by a pink ribbon had grown into a woman who wore it with pride. And as Zoe walked toward her future, hand in hand with the woman she loved, she knew that she wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.